In the last video, I briefly explained that nearly all scientists today believe the universe had a beginning, and I gave a couple reasons why that is. I made that video because every worldview has an origin story that goes with it, and so far as I can tell, every worldview fits into one of 5 categories. Because there are tens of thousands of different denominations of the various world religions, virtually no one has time to examine every claim or even identify them all. If you want to know what is true, or if you want to help someone else determine what is true, then I think it will be useful to consider the merits of each category and see if there are whole categories that can be ruled out so that you can focus your attention more carefully on the most plausible categories. If you think you already know what is true, I think it's still worth going through the exercise of examining these various categories to verify that you haven't been led down the wrong path, possibly by well-meaning people who happen to have inherited wrong beliefs and then passed them on to you. It's also valuable to know why you know what you believe, because if your beliefs are rooted in reason that you can communicate to someone else, then you can do so confidently with the expectation that a reasonable person would find your arguments at least plausible, if not persuasive. If the only reason you can give to someone who asks you about your faith is that Mama told me so, or I've experienced a certain feeling, or maybe the Bible says so, without having any reasons to give in support of why any of those sources are reliable, you may find difficulty persuading anyone to think your way. Hopefully this presentation will help you think about some of these things more clearly and help build your confidence and preparedness for future conversations. I think it's surprising that the universe exists at all. Of course, if the universe didn't exist, we wouldn't be here to talk about it, but no explanation is required to explain that something doesn't exist. For example, I don't know anyone who is puzzled by the fact that there are apparently no 3-headed elephants, no mammals with exoskeletons, and no flying unicorns. The fact that these creatures do not exist pose no philosophical problems for anyone. But the fact that the universe is here and that it is populated with innumerable creatures of incredible variety is very puzzling, given what we know about matter, energy, time, probability, and the extraordinary complexity of the systems in the universe, especially the interdependent systems we find in living organisms, perhaps most of all in our own bodies, our own thoughts, and our conscious experience of the world. That any of this exists is quite amazing. So providing any coherent explanation for the existence of all this is challenging regardless of which worldview you embrace. If you're watching the video version of this presentation, you can see that there's a table that shows how people in these groups usually think about 6 questions. These 6 questions at the top of each column are: is the universe eternal? What is the cause or beginning of the universe? What is the origin of God or the gods? What is the origin of matter? What is the origin of life? What is the origin of species? While there are many different worldviews and various explanations for how the universe began, or had no beginning, so far as I can tell, all of them fit into one of 5 major categories relative to the idea of God or gods, which are listed in the first column of each row. 0 gods, atheism; 1 God, monotheism; multiple gods, polytheism; everything is God, pantheism and panentheism; and virtual reality. In conversations between people in these various categories, you'll often find that people make arguments against the theories of other groups. But you'll rarely find someone making the case that all the categories, including their own, are surprising, or that all of them seem quite fantastical. For example, theists will often point out how absurd it is to think that the universe originated spontaneously without a creator, how improbable it is that the incredible variety of species on Earth could have evolved from a single ancestor, and perhaps especially how unlikely it is that biological life could have gotten started all by itself with no intelligent agent behind it. Atheists will often respond by pointing out that the theists make an even bolder claim, that there was a creator God who has always existed, who created everything else. They often make the case that positing an even more amazing, uncaused explanation than the effect it is supposed to explain is even more absurd. I intend to show that all 5 categories of explanations make incredible claims, each of which would seem to be fantastical and unlikely if considered by itself. However, this list of categories appears to exhaust the logical possibilities. If you know of another category that doesn't fit into one of these I've listed, please let me know. If it is the case that all worldviews fit into one of these 5 categories, then the actual truth must be in one of these categories. Perhaps considering the claims of each category and comparing them with the evidence can help us decide what is actually true, or maybe we can at least rule out some of the options that don't fit with the evidence we have. Some of the answers to the questions addressed in this table are probably almost self-evident if you think about them carefully, but some others were surprising to me as I investigated what other people have to say about their own worldview. I'll start with virtual reality because it is so different from the other options in this table. Usually the idea here is that we don't actually physically exist, and that we and everything we can perceive in the universe are part of a computer program. This perspective assumes that there is another virtual or actual reality that our virtual reality exists within. But people who hold this view of the world usually don't claim to know much, if anything, about the reality or realities that we are supposedly exist within. Because of this, they don't have anything definitive to say about base reality or the existence of a god or gods. In their view, matter, life, and species in this reality are all virtual, so their origin is rooted in the intelligence of whoever or whatever programmed this virtual reality. A YouTube search on virtual reality and universes will yield a lot of results, many of which are interesting. It seems like a big fraction of those videos are by people who either believe in it or are inclined to believe in it. So they're mostly aimed at explaining what the idea is and how it could make sense. I'm a monotheist and a Christian partly because I don't think any of these other categories in the table make good sense of the data that we have available to us. However, I can see why people might be attracted to the virtual reality idea. A lot of videos about it make it sound quite plausible, and some people, such as Elon Musk, have gone so far as to say that the chance that we live in base reality and not a virtual world is 1 in billions. The rapid pace of progress with computers and video games in particular over the last 40 years or so makes it seem like simulating a world in a way that programmed characters living in that world would not be able to tell that they were in a simulation could be a plausible future that we could implement ourselves. I don't know very much technical information about computer programming or about processing power and data storage, but there's a guy who put out a video talking about the amount of raw data and processing power that it would take to simulate the universe. If his math and understanding about programming and computing are right, then it would take an enormous computer, even at the highest density and the highest processing power that is conceivable in this universe, in order to simulate another universe. It seems to me that the implication of his computations is that no one would have the resources and the ability to implement such a thing, even if they had the desire and the knowledge of how to do so. The scope and magnitude of what he suggests would be required to produce this universe would, in my estimation, only be possible for a godlike being or beings. You can find the link to his video in the episode notes below on YouTube and on the understandingperspectives.com website if you would like to know what he has to say about this. While I can appreciate the appeal of this kind of perspective, because it does make some sense in view of the rapid progress in computing over the last several decades, I think that most of the advocates of this view fail to recognize the magnitude of what they are suggesting. They aren't talking about virtualizing an instance of Windows XP inside of Windows 10. They're talking about virtualizing entire universes inside of perhaps many layers of other virtual universes, which are all based in some incredible supercomputer of untold computing and storage power in a real world whose origins and workings we know nothing about. This perspective does have a certain advantage over the others insofar as it does not propose a strictly supernatural explanation for the origin of this universe, and it doesn't have an uncaused beginning, spontaneous generation of life with no intelligence behind it, and it doesn't have to presume unguided evolution as the mechanism by which we get all the speciation in life. It shifts all these questions to another universe that we don't have access to. In spite of this conceptual advantage, I don't know of any actual evidence for this perspective. It's entirely speculative and, from what I can tell, highly problematic because of the sheer magnitude of what it would take to virtualize a universe like this. I'll grant that there is theoretically value in virtualizing any number of different things for many different reasons, but it's hard for me to imagine that it would ever be worth it to pursue a virtualization of this scope and scale, even if it was possible to do so. The idea that it could happen even once seems like science fiction on steroids to me, but the idea that there could be perhaps millions or billions of nested, virtualized universes, all of which have their computing power based in some host machine and base reality, seems beyond crazy to me. Don't take my word for it. You should listen to the video in the link, and you should listen to other people talk about this too. Just because I think this is nuts and that there doesn't appear to be any evidence for this doesn't mean it isn't true. It's an interesting theory, at least. Atheists often define themselves as not having a positive belief about the existence of any gods. If you spend much time on an atheist forum, you'll find that a lot of them spend a lot of time explaining that they lack belief in any gods, rather than asserting that there are in fact no gods. From what I can tell, many people take this approach because it technically does not require them to prove their position, because they aren't making a positive claim. They're merely denying positive belief in any gods on the basis that insufficient evidence has been provided to them to believe in one or more gods. This provides them with a distinct technical advantage in debates with theists because, by definition, they are making a weaker claim that doesn't actually require proof. One side effect of this perspective is that the focus on merely claiming to lack belief often results in conversations between atheists and theists that lack real substance. It appears to me that their claim to merely disbelieve seems to distract them from facing the difficulties with the implications of the sort of worldview their disbelief aligns with. It seems to me that there is no meaningful difference between lacking a belief in any gods and believing that there are no gods in practical terms relating to the choices people make because of the things they believe. The primary value of making the lesser claim appears to be merely rhetorical and strategic when having conversations with theists. They often ridicule theists for believing in fairy tales, but they usually don't seem to notice, or perhaps simply won't admit, that their own view has as many or perhaps more major difficulties than some of the other categories. In recent times, most atheists have come to believe that the universe had a beginning. They usually believe that there was some kind of singularity from which all matter and energy erupted something like 14 billion years ago. They don't believe in any gods. They usually believe that life originated spontaneously, without the guidance of an intelligent designer. And they normally believe that evolution through the process of sexual reproduction and mutations, along with the process of natural selection by the survival of the fittest and their ability to reproduce, resulted in the vast number of species that exist today. Those are all major claims, but for some reason many atheists appear to think that their theories about these things aren't very far-fetched, and that their position should be the default one until scientific proof can demonstrate that one of these other possibilities is right. They are very big on demanding proof for the existence of a god or gods, but they're very willing to accept atheism without any good explanations for how or why the universe began, why there was a Big Bang, how it is that evolution got started, because it requires a mutating, self-replicating, living organism in order to even get started. I think their biggest weakness is related to the origin of life, because at its core, life is based on information that is encoded in the DNA of every living thing, which is used to produce every part of itself. Small errors and mutations in the genetic code often produce terrible, often fatal diseases and deformities. Even if you have a cell or an animal or a plant or a person that is in every way complete and assembled, if you kill it, you can't bring it back to life again. The idea that the first cell formed on its own without any intelligent guidance, and that it was able to survive and replicate and mutate and evolve without any kind of intelligence guiding the process, is an incredible claim. It seems to me that most of the atheists that I've heard or read don't feel the weight of this objection as deeply as they should. It's a big one. There are numerous other arguments against atheism, such as the fine-tuning of the universe, the Kalam cosmological argument, where does morality come from? Why do we inherently believe that human life has value if there is no source of higher purpose? The teleological argument, and others. Let's move on to pantheism and panentheism. Pantheism is the idea that everything that exists is part of God, and panentheism is the idea that God is more than the universe, but that the universe and all the stuff and all the people and all the other beings in the universe are all part of God. They usually believe that the universe is eternal, and therefore the universe did not have a cause because it has always existed. Usually they believe that God has always existed. Some of them believe that matter is eternal, and others believe that matter goes through a series of rebirths somehow. They usually think that life and the origin of species is an evolutionary thing. There are two main arguments for pantheism that I know about. Sometimes people feel like God is close to them, or all around them, especially when they're out in nature. This intuition inclines some people towards pantheism. The traditional ideas of omnipresence, omniscience, and the complete dependence of creation on the existence of God pushes some people in the direction of thinking that God and the universe aren't really distinct at all. Here are some arguments against pantheism. The idea that we are distinct beings rather than part of a larger entity that is God is one of the most universal experiences that people have. The idea that horrible people, like Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot, as well as every turd, every snake, and all the ugly stuff in the world are all part of God, just as much as the rest of us, turns many people against pantheism. Many people never experience the intuition that they are connected to nature or other people in the way that they would expect if we were all part of God. Let's move on to polytheism. Polytheists usually believe that the universe is eternal, so in their view, there was no cause for the beginning since there wasn't one. By definition, polytheists believe in multiple gods, but there are numerous different kinds of polytheists with different origin stories for the many gods that they believe exist. Some polytheists believe there was one eternal God from whom all the other gods were spawned. Others believe that one or multiple gods spontaneously came into existence out of the eternal chaos. They usually believe that matter itself is eternal. They're divided about the origin of life and the origin of species, whether it was a special creation by one or more of the gods, or whether it was through an evolutionary process. From what I can tell, there is a wide variety of opinions among polytheists about all these questions, and very often they don't seem to be very interested in the ultimate origin of everything. In many cases, they're content to just follow the traditions that they grew up in, or perhaps that they were attracted to for some other reason. A lot of them claim to have experiences with their gods that they find to be personally persuasive. A good number of them do not seem to be driven by intellectual concerns, but instead they appear to be focused primarily on how to engage with the gods. I haven't spent a lot of time engaging with polytheists, but I have joined numerous polytheist Facebook groups, and these are the sort of impressions I got from spending some time there. These are some of the arguments against polytheism that I know about. The variety of polytheism where multiple gods spontaneously came to exist out of the pre-existing eternal chaos seems the most problematic to me, because in that view, there was only chaos, and from chaos, one or more powerful gods emerged, fully formed with numerous powers intact and the ability to procreate. In a sense, this issue of origin of the gods, or the god, is really the big issue for every perspective. There's a link below the video on YouTube and on the page for this video on understandingperspectives.com for the graphic you can see on the screen right now. It shows the origin of each of the gods in one of the pantheons of gods. From the perspective of this chart, the eternal elements are earth, air, water, and fire, and 5 gods somehow came into being independently from within the pre-existing chaos of these elements. This is a real problem for polytheism from a scientific standpoint, because matter and energy do not seem to be good candidates for being eternal, because everything tends toward entropy. You can listen to episode 18, which is only 2 minutes long, for more details about this question. Pantheism and Panentheism usually share the same problem, because they usually believe that matter is eternal also. From my perspective, this all boils down to the question of what came first. Was matter and energy first, and the gods formed spontaneously from within that framework? Could it be that matter, energy, and God are all co-eternal and aren't really distinct from each other at all? Was there some kind of eternal singularity of superconcentrated matter and energy that erupted and produced the universe as a one-shot event that will ultimately lead to dispersed energy and matter in a dead universe? Is there an eternal, intelligent, and powerful God who created everything else? Could this universe and all the beings in it be one of perhaps billions of virtual realities that are all nested within other virtual realities that all exist within base reality that is eternal, or that had a beginning, born of chaos, a singular God, multiple gods, or in a base reality where everything is God? Could we be living in a virtual reality like the Matrix, and the universe, as far as we know it, is all an elaborate illusion within a real world that is entirely hidden from us? Before I move on to talk about monotheism in more detail, I'll try to summarize the other views and highlight their biggest problems. While superficially plausible, virtual reality is highly problematic because of the vast computing resources it would take to virtualize the universe. Even using quantum-level storage devices at the highest storage density conceivable, and similarly high-level computing power, the computer it would take to run such a program will be inconceivably large according to the calculations in the video I linked to. The idea that many such virtual universes might be nested in deep and wide layers within an unimaginable supercomputer and base reality is hard to imagine, especially considering there is no actual evidence for such a view. Both polytheists and pantheists usually believe that matter is eternal, which makes little sense from what we know of science. If matter and energy are not eternal, then they must have an origin rooted in something that existed prior to them. In my view, pantheism is fully counterintuitive and is backwards to my own experience. I find nothing to be more real and compelling than my own conscious perception of myself and my experience of the world around me. So it seems that the universe actually is real. I have never experienced anything that leads me to believe that my personal experience is fully illusory and that I am actually just part of God experiencing itself. Atheism has many problems, some of which it shares with the other views, but at bottom, one of the biggest problems with it, in my opinion, is that information appears to be primary, at least in the sense that all known life is based on genetic code that is the source of every body plan, every organ, every bone, every blood vessel, every fingernail, every hair, every protein, etc. The first living cell had to have the information built into it to enable it to live. It had to have potential to mutate. It had to derive its energy through photosynthesis or by consuming some kind of food, which presumably did not exist in the way we normally think of food, because everything we eat today was once alive, whether a plant or an animal. It also had to have the ability to reproduce itself. All these abilities had to be built into the first cell before evolution could even get started. So this brings me to monotheism, which is what I believe. I'm not just a monotheist, I'm a Christian, and I'm well aware of the fact that there are serious objections to my own view. I've already mentioned perhaps the biggest one that atheists often raise, which is Christians make the amazing claim that there is an eternal God who is powerful, wise, loving, and good, who created all the matter and energy in the universe, in addition to the claim that he designed it to be like it is and created all life. When Christians point out the absurdity and improbability that all the universe spontaneously erupted from a singularity, producing all the matter and energy and information and life that we know today, the atheists point out that the God we claim created all of this is an even more complex, more amazing being to suppose exists, and that it is a lesser claim to suggest all this happened by accident. I think this is a strong objection. However, I would point out that every single category in the list makes amazing, apparently fantastical claims for itself, and there does not appear to be any other category of explanation to appeal to. So it seems to me that we are left to look at the evidence that is available to us and answer the question of what explanation best fits the evidence. There are numerous reasons that I think that monotheism makes the most sense, but it's the overall case of Christianity in particular and how it appears to fit with the evidence in a way that makes good sense all around that persuades me to believe it. While saying that an eternal, powerful, intelligent, and loving God exists is a bold claim to make, it does make good sense of the world as it is now if you consider the big picture view of the Bible and the stated goals that God wants to accomplish. Revelation 21, 3b through 4 says, "Look, God's home is now among his people. He will live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them. He'll wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things are gone forever." When asked what the greatest commandment was, Jesus replied, "The most important commandment is this. Listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one and only Lord. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these." As I understand the Bible in general, and these verses in particular, these are the primary goals God has for us. He wants to live with us on the new earth, and he only wants people who will love him and each other to be there. With that end goal in mind, he created the world we currently live in as a means to obtaining that ultimate goal. I think the central part of his goal is to populate the new earth with loving people. He could have just created that new earth with most of its fine qualities from the start and skipped over this world. But I don't think he could have populated it with inherently loving people, because an essential element of love is the freedom and power of choice. I don't think it is possible for a person to be or become a genuinely loving person if they never had the ability or opportunity to reject love. Consider your own experience and the people in your life who may love you. Is their love for you valuable to you? Or if you're looking for people to love you, would it be important for you that they love you freely? If you could insert a computer chip into their ear that would control their brain somehow, such that they would always act toward you in ways that were perfectly loving, would you do it? If you did do that, wouldn't it be clear to you all the time that the reason they were loving you was actually that you were manipulating and controlling them? Would that really be satisfying and meaningful to you? Wouldn't that reduce your relationship to a meaningless robotic one? Maybe you would enjoy such an experience for a while, especially compared to whatever life you've been living. But what if you were eternal? Wouldn't you get bored with such an existence after a while? Wouldn't such a relationship ultimately be empty and pointless? I think it would be for an eternal, powerful God whose very nature is love. So if God values love and wants to create a world to live in with people who love him and each other, how could he accomplish that? What kind of circumstances would need to exist where God could put large numbers of people through processes that would result in at least some of them becoming the kind of people he wants? I think they would need to live in a somewhat ambiguous world where God would need to be largely obscured from them so that they would not experience overt coercion of any kind that could taint the process. This would require something far more elaborate than a big dome like the one in the movie The Truman Show. After all, this world would need to hold billions of these people, and a whole lot of them would be very interested in finding out what kind of situation they're really in. This would have to be a pretty big world in a pretty big context that could potentially be explained by other causes besides an omnipotent God. God would also need to hide himself from people so they wouldn't experience coercion from the magnitude of his presence. But he would need to communicate with them somehow so they could know what it is that he even wants from them. A very complex world will be required to accomplish a grand set of goals like this. Interestingly, that is very much the kind of world we find ourselves in, as I have already shown from the descriptions I've given in the other 4 categories of worldviews that I know of. I suppose that this is indirect evidence that the God of the Bible is real, but it does fit nicely into the overall narrative in a way that makes sense to me. If an eternal, powerful, loving, and intelligent God exists, then that would explain how a world like the one we live in could exist. The incredible complexity at every level of existence, from the vast reaches of the universe down to the smallest particles of matter that we can observe, can be explained adequately by the existence of a God like the one the Bible describes. The little disputed fact that the universe had a beginning fits naturally with the biblical narrative about the creation of the world by God. In fact, this is one of the main ways that the Bible indicates that we can see the evidence that God exists. Psalm 19, 1 through 2 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge." This fits nicely with the evidence too. I mentioned that God would need to communicate with us in some way so that we could know what he wants, but in a way that would not be overly coercive to us. Generally speaking, this is the kind of self-revelation we find from him in the Bible. Angels came to people at times, and sometimes God worked through prophets that he communicated with in ways that he didn't with regular people. He revealed himself most clearly through his son Jesus. In the first sermon Peter delivered after the resurrection, this is what he said: "Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him." God communicated to us through Jesus, and did miracles through him. So we would take him seriously, even raising him from the dead, giving him a new body, and exalting him to rule at the right hand of God because of his faithful obedience to the point of death. The significance of Jesus as the most famous person in human history adds significant weight to the claims that he made about God. The fact that his followers were so convinced that they had seen him alive again over a 40-day period after he had been crucified and put in a tomb, so that they were willing to endure persecution and even rejoice at the idea that they were counted worthy to be persecuted for his sake, carries a lot of weight too. Normal people don't willingly suffer persecution in order to promote ideas that they know to be false. People share what seems to be a universal longing for meaning and significance, to the point that people sometimes kill themselves because their lives seem empty or pointless. The Bible indicates that we were created for a relationship with God, and many people who live in a relationship with him report finding satisfaction of this longing through their connection with him. This makes perfect sense if the God of the Bible is real. The other perspectives have a harder time explaining this universal longing. Atheism in particular has a difficult time with this because on atheism there is no higher purpose for anything. Generally speaking, evolutionary theory works according to the fitness for survival and reproduction principle. If a feature develops that gives a creature an advantage in both survival and reproduction, that feature will supposedly have a greater tendency to prevail and become prominent. Since it appears that nothing in reality corresponds as a stimulus that could explain why this feature would have evolved, it will be strange for it to emerge as a universal property of human consciousness. Another fact worth noting is that despite their numerous differences, Jews, Christians, and Muslims account for the vast majority of monotheists in the world. They all claim to worship the God of Abraham. Generally speaking, it seems to me that monotheism fits most naturally with the evidence, especially in the sense that it best explains the existence of the information at the heart of biological life. There are innumerable problems, like the one where you try to sort out which came first, the chicken or the egg, with other views, and very many problems of irreducible complexity with living organisms that many people fail to fully appreciate. None of these problems exist for monotheism because God created all these systems with the required information built in when He created them in the first place. When you combine that with the evidence of the resurrection and the way that the current world makes sense of this phase of creation that the Bible locates us in, and the universal longing that people find fulfillment for in their relationship with God, and lots of other arguments for Christianity, you end up with a worldview that fits the evidence well. People raise many other objections to Christianity, mostly on the basis of what I consider to be misunderstandings of Scripture. But the only one major objection at the category level is the idea that a loving, powerful, eternal God exists at all. If another category had a more plausible explanation for these important concepts, it would be worth considering, but they all seem to have deep flaws from my perspective. As I see it, arriving at a confident conclusion about the existence of God is not possible if you're looking for absolute proof. But if you're willing to examine the evidence and make a choice based on where the evidence points, only one category and one religion within that category really checks all the boxes and makes good sense of the data, so far as I can tell. For me, that is Christianity.